Alright, this time we're going to talk about precise placement of materials using the Unwrap UVW modifier. So first of all, let's just select our robot's body, and we're going to isolate the selection. That way we don't have all kinds of other stuff cluttering up the screen while we're trying to paint on this guy. Alright, so we're going to go to the modifier list, and we're going to apply the Unwrap UVW modifier. So once I apply Unwrap, Unwrap will automatically generate these green seams on the object. Sometimes they're in a good spot and sometimes they're not. So we're going to take a look and we're going to go to the polygon subobject mode, Control A to select all, and then open the UV editor. Now that just automatically selects everything for me. And then we're going to go to mapping and we're going to try flatten mapping. Flatten mapping is going to break up the object into islands or chunks based on a face angle threshold. So as we adjust the face angle threshold here, let's try 60. We're going to turn off rotate clusters and fill holes. That's going to make sure that the objects or the chunks that it breaks up stay in their relative alignment to each other. So we'll hit OK, and we see it breaks it up into some kind of odd chunks. So we're going to go back to mapping, back to flatten. We're going to try this with a slightly different threshold. So let's try 50. So it breaks it up into relatively nice uniform pieces here. So I like the way that works, and I'm going to turn on the checkerboard pattern. Now, it says checker pattern here, but it's not showing in the viewport, and it won't until I actually click on it in the list. When I click on it in the list, it actually shows it to me in my viewport. So if we deselect the chunks so that they aren't highlighted red here, we'll see what they look like on the object in the viewport, and I can see that there's some stretching on the object. I want to avoid stretching as much as possible, so we're going to reselect our pieces. If I turn on select element, when I select through, I don't have to make sure I grab every polygon, it'll select everything for me. And then under reshape elements, I'm going to use relax until flat. The relax tool then reshapes the way these polygons are structured in the UV editor to keep as much or as little stretching out of the material and the object as possible. That's always the goal. We want to avoid any stretching wherever possible on the object. Alright, so that looks pretty good there, but now we want to reorganize these pieces just a little bit to keep everything pulled away from the edge. Now, it's not as important in 3ds Max when we're going to do our viewport painting to keep our elements away from the edge. But if we're going to go to something like Mudbox, Mudbox gets very upset if any of our pieces actually touch the edge of our UV space. So we'll actually grab everything, we're going to go to our scale tool, and we're going to scale that down just slightly. Now, by scaling everything, it keeps all the pieces in proportion to each other, but it also makes sure that nothing is touching the edges. So if we do ever want to go to something like Mudbox, we do, like I said, want to make sure that nothing's touching the edges. All right, so we can close that, and then we're going to go to Tools, Viewport Canvas. The Viewport Canvas tool is going to allow me to paint directly on my object. Now, if I don't want to see any of these seams on my object in my viewport, I can just right-click and convert it to an editable poly. By doing that, I'm basically baking in the unwrap into my object, so the unwrap is still there, it's just baked into the edit poly level. Alright, so now if I go to my paintbrush, and ask what I want to do, I have to have at least a standard material assigned to my object before I start. So we'll start with assigned material, and then I want to paint on the diffuse color. So now I'm going to tell it, well, we'll start with a 1024, because that's a decent size, but it's not super high res. This character is going to end up being pretty small on screen in the final piece, so we don't need a 2048. That's going to be overkill. And I need to decide where I'm going to save it. So we'll hit that, and then we'll go to our correct section here, and we'll save over the top. Alright, so now that that's showing, we want to show our map in our viewport, and map channel 1 is good. So we hit OK, and now it shows me I just have a solid gray object. Bring up our layers dialog box, and I want to add a layer. I definitely don't want to work on the background layer. The background layer really is just kind of for my initial paint texture. So I'm going to add a new layer, and then we're going to start working on this layer. Alright, let's maximize this viewport so we can see a little bit better. And now my brush tool's here. My radius is at 25, my opacity is at 100, and the hardness is 90. The lower the hardness goes, you can see there, the softer the edge of the brush gets. Another thing you'll want to notice is that as I increase or decrease the size of the radius, but if I zoom in and out of my viewport, my brush gets way, way bigger. Well, it's not actually that the brush is getting bigger, but as the object changes size, my brush doesn't change size with it. My brush is sized based on a viewport setting, not an object setting. So let's increase the hardness back up there, and we're just going to rough over the areas that I'm going to end up wanting red. Now, one nice thing I can also do is turn on mirroring. If I turn on mirroring in X, see as I paint one side here, I'm also painting the other. Obviously, at this point, I'm not worried about precise placement of anything. The reason for that is I'm going to apply another material on top of that, and I'm going to cover up these edges. So we'll switch to black. And then we're going to make our brush radius here quite a bit smaller, so that as we paint, we control where we see this. Now, again, I'm not too worried about perfection here. As I zoom in, I'll be able to get much more precise. And if I go over the edge there a little bit, I hold on the Shift key and then drag over. And the Shift key then basically accesses the eraser tool so that I can paint up to edges and then fix edges that I've painted across too far. So by just kind of glopping the red on to begin with, it makes it so that I can just kind of paint over the top of that edge, and I don't have to worry about the red not being exactly where it's supposed to be. I just paint the black exactly where I want it. Now let's just undo that one. Now as we go, we'll just kind of fine tune that edge. Now, you can tell I'm not painting all the way out around my object, because we'll back out in a minute here. We'll back out so that the brush size itself gets apparently larger and we can cover a much larger area. So I just want to fine tune around the edge of this red band so that when I back out, I can just work on kind of the big picture. So at this point, I'm not too worried about exactly where the edges of those polys are. I'm just trying to smooth out the edges of the image itself. Now we can back way out. We can even make the brush radius a little bit bigger. And then we can paint some large areas here and fill this in pretty quickly. Now from here, we're going to add one more layer, and we're going to switch to white, and we're going to turn on this mask image. So if I click on the mask image, there's some pretty cool, just basic presets that come with Max for some of these. So let's turn on this rough one. Now, I can also turn on randomize, which is going to randomize both the radius, the opacity. Let's go hardness and scatter. All right, we can also randomize the color a little bit. So now as we paint over this, we're going to turn off our X mirroring. And then as I paint, we're going to decrease our opacity here a little bit. So as I paint, we're going to get some kind of nice random scattering to this brush that's going to let our robot toy appear to have been beaten up a bit. Now, as a boy's toy that's sitting there, it seems appropriate for this one to be kind of beaten. I know both myself and my son definitely tend to beat our toys up a bit. Alright, so now that I've got some kind of good beaten spots on there, we're going to go back to our smudge tool. I'm going to decrease the size of the brush a bit, and we're going to smudge this around. Let's turn off that mask. And let's go down and turn off our randomizing. So we can get this to streak a bit here. Opacity still a little strong. So if I get this, kind of where I want it, I'm not going to worry too much about perfection here. I can also use some blending modes within these tools to adjust how this kind of sits over the top. All right, so let's call that good, and then we're going to look at our alignment or our blending mode here. So we're going to turn on screen and see what that does. No real change. Let's try overlay. Overlay makes it go away. Try multiply. Can't really see multiply. Lighten. Lighten should be about the same. You can see difference does some pretty fun things with color. Exclusion. A lot of this is very similar to what the tools are for blending modes in Photoshop. So we can go back to normal, and then let's adjust the opacity. As I decrease the opacity, I'll really kind of dim that out and push it back. So we've got to find kind of a happy medium here, where things are actually visible, but not so noticeable that they completely take over. And I can adjust some more by just kind of smudging it out. And then we can always go back in, either on this layer or on another layer, and add a little bit more detail over the top. So let's do that. Let's add another layer, and then we'll go back with our paintbrush and a much lower opacity, same mask, and maybe a grayer value here. So now as I paint, I can add back some of that detail that's in the brush itself without completely covering up all of the smudging. And then this layer, its opacity can also be adjusted to fine-tune the overall look of our object. Now, when I feel like I'm done and ready to move on to something else, all I need to do is right-click. When I right-click, we're going to either continue painting, save as PSD, which is nice to be able to do, or we can flatten the layers and save the current texture, which was a JPEG when we originally created it. So let's just flatten and save the current texture. So when we do that, it initially applies a bit of a brighter version of it, but then kind of backs it back down where it should be. Now, if I also saved this as a PSD, it would allow me to go into Photoshop and edit those layers. For now, we're not going to worry about that. We'll do that in a different project.